A common sentiment with Devil May Cry is that it's a decent game worth playing if you want to experience one of the pioneers of the genre, but only if you can stomach the parts that have aged badly. I disagree with a lot of that because this game is still unique. Devil May Cry was an experience that's quite unlike any action game that I've played. It's a wildly experimental proof of concept that remains very well crafted, with some excellent boss fights that still meet modern standards. The most vexing part of this game is the camera. It's what people point to when they talk about the game being antiquated. These arguments aren't unjust, but I don't think it should be enough to stop you from trying the game yourself, even if you just beat it once. DMC has garnered some attention again thanks to the success of DMC 5 and the recent release of a special edition / DLC for that game, and I'm glad. I hope it can bring some light to the games before it, particularly the original, because I think this game is really special. You can see Devil May Cry's influence in many action games after it, and for that reason alone, I think it's worth checking out. Being that it's one of the first of its kind, there is still a lot to criticize here, and that's what this video is for. I'd like to do a breakdown of as many aspects of Devil May Cry as I can, what works and what doesn't, so consider that a spoiler warning. I'll be talking largely about Devil May Cry 1, but we'll draw some examples from 3 to 5 as well. There's not much to spoil in these games, but if you want to play them yourself, now would be a good time to go do that.
Let's rock, baby.
My opinion of Devil May Cry only got better as I did subsequent playthroughs, and for me, this was the most telling testament of the game's strength. Some people like to just play games until they see the credits and move on, while others may revisit specific levels or replay the whole game to deepen their understanding and enjoyment of it. I usually fall into the first camp, but I felt very compelled to play this game again after beating it once. Then again after beating it a second time, and so on until I played through it 7 times, at which point I felt qualified enough to talk about it at length like this. That replay itch is very deliberate. This game was designed to be played through at least 3 times, which then calls into question whether the gameplay is good and varied enough to justify that. Replayability is important to a lot of people. It can give you a great sense of satisfaction that you've mastered the game's mechanics and uncovered everything the developers wanted you to, while enjoying that experience every step of the way. Fortunately, Devil May Cry does very well on this front. This game was created to be a challenge for people that play less demanding games, so difficulty was a big consideration while it was in development. You start out by playing on either easy or normal difficulty. Once you beat that, you unlock the hard difficulty, and once you beat that, you unlock Dante Must Die, or DMD, which feels like how the game was meant to be played. In many games, difficulty options feel like an afterthought. Devil May Cry makes them a focal point by creating a difficulty structure where all levels have a meaningful purpose. You must play them sequentially, so normal is there to teach you, and hard is there to bridge the gap between that and Dante Must Die. Other action games after DMC follow this exact same formula because it works. Bayonetta is an example that comes to mind, but it is worth considering the game's pacing when using this system. If difficulties are meant to be played sequentially, then the level of challenge as you play through them should feel like a gradual rise. DMC takes a hit here because the gap between normal and hard is much smaller than the gap between hard and Dante Must Die. Perhaps my view of this is skewed because I'm looking at it in retrospect, but the level of difficulty felt like a very steep exponential curve rather than a linear one. Going from normal to hard is fine. You'll encounter more challenging enemy layouts and take more damage, but if you've practiced a bit, it's largely just a more unforgiving experience. But the step up between hard and Dante Must Die is brutal. Bosses unlock their full movesets and become long endurance tests where you can only make 3 or 4 mistakes. The actual difficulty of DMD is good. Again, it feels like the level of challenge that the game was conceived at, but it's such a massive difference from hard that a lot of bosses can become brick walls that kill your momentum. When I did my first run on hard, I could beat it without too many game overs, but on DMD, it took me a couple of days just to break past the last Nello Angelo fight. From what I've gathered in online forums, this isn't uncommon. In that regard, it can feel like your progression has grinded to a halt because it's a far cry from what you're used to. So, what's the solution? Should there have been a 4th difficulty level between hard and DMD to smooth out the curve, or is the massive spike intentional and meant to be part of the experience? I imagine it's probably intentional, and having an additional difficulty level would exacerbate the time needed for DMC to reach its peaks. So this could have been solved just by making hard a little bit more difficult than it is. Widen the gap between hard and normal to shrink the gap between hard and DMD. Not only would it prepare you better, it would also make hard feel a little more relevant than it is. There's also the question that I proposed earlier. Is the combat good enough to warrant all these multiple playthroughs? The answer is yes, but interestingly, it has little to do with the combat itself. There are two ways that Devil May Cry keeps combat interesting, and both of them are because they encourage variety: intricate enemy design and an emphasis on combos via the style rankings. Let's start with that first one. Combat in this game is relatively simplistic, at least by modern standards. You have one button to unleash melee attacks that vary between one of two weapon types, and another button for ranged attacks that also vary between the different guns. You can hold a shoulder button to lock onto an enemy, roll sideways or jump to dodge, and switch in and out of Devil Trigger, which gives you enhanced speed, attack power, and access to special moves, all at the cost of a separate meter. Within the weapons themselves, you don't exactly have a ton of options. There are 4 melee weapons in the game, 3 of which have the same control scheme: the Force Edge, Alistair, and Sparta. The only differences are that Alistair can use every sword attack, whereas Sparta doesn't have the Devil Trigger exclusive moves, and the Force Edge only has basic combos. All in all, there's only 9 possible attacks in total on Alistair. The other melee weapon, the Ifrit Gauntlets, has even less moves. It has 7 attacks, one of which is just a powered up jump, while letting you charge most of your attacks for extra damage. In order to make use of Dante's overall basic kit, enemies are generally designed so that you can exercise all of your options without an obvious best attack or best weapon for a given scenario. Marionettes and fetishes, for instance, are the most frail enemies in the game. If they aren't devil triggered, they have pretty low health and are susceptible to knockups. You can utilize Alistair's quick high time to set them up for a juggle with the guns, or burst them down with Ifrit since their attack animations are slow enough to give you charging time. The nobodies are tankier enemies with more resistance to hit stun. Since their telegraphs are harder to read, you might want to use Alistair's quick basic attack chains for a non-committal approach, or use your extremely bursty Inferno attack with the Ifrit at the cost of your Devil Trigger. On-the-fly choices like these are everywhere in the game. The only enemies that demand you fight a certain way are Shadows, who you have to shoot at to expose their core, and maybe Beelzebubs, who are too erratic to hit reliably with melee attacks. It leaves a lot of room for experimentation and discovery about what strategies work for you. This means that fighting the same enemy multiple times can have different outcomes, which is what allows the game to keep throwing them at you at higher difficulties. This is coupled with the fact that enemy layouts are changed entirely on hard and DMD. The tougher endgame enemies are placed in earlier areas, which is a great way to give the player time to actually experiment against them. This is all supplemented a little bit by guns, which adds some optional variety without taking away from any complexity. Unlike with melee weapons, ranged weapons all handle the same way: you lock on and you shoot. The decision making here comes down to whichever gun you choose to use. Ebony and Ivory are rapid-fire, low-damage pistols. The shotgun is a short-range burst attack. The grenade gun has a slow-moving AoE projectile, and the Nightmare Beta can be charged to ricochet off of walls. For the most part, I like the inclusion of these weapons even though they don't require the same level of engagement as the melee weapons. You can use guns to sneak in a bit of extra damage during downtime against some bosses without being too risky, again for that optional variety. The second way DMC keeps combat interesting is via the style ranking system, which has now become a series staple. As you fight enemies, you gain style ranks based on how varied and skillful your combat is. This culminates in a letter grade at the end, ranging from D to S, as a general indicator for how well you did. Again, a scoring system is something that a lot of games now use. It's a bit reminiscent of arcade leaderboards, which makes sense given Hideki Kamiya's affinity for those. Style rankings have become one of my favorite things in this series. It is, however, worth considering the effect that scoring systems can have, particularly on players that aren't used to the genre. When you're first starting out with games like this, you'll probably be getting the equivalent of D or C rankings on nearly every level and every fight. This is especially true with Devil May Cry because it controls differently to most other games like it. There's no dedicated dodge button, the lock-on being a hold demands more of you than if it was a toggle, and the camera takes a lot of getting used to. It can take nearly a whole playthrough to get a decent grasp of everything, and to unlock and explore all of Dante's moves. Because of that, you're not playing stylishly and getting low ranks as a result, which puts you in a constant negative feedback loop for an entire run. You could argue that the reward for beating a tough boss should be the sense of satisfaction rather than the letter grade you get at the end, but having a scoring system that's too strict rips that satisfaction away when you felt like you were playing adequately and still ended up with the D ranking. This is the problem that Devil May Cry has. Some of the scoring elements are too strict. The style ranking overall is a bit more shoddily done in this game compared to DMC3 for a few reasons. The timing you have to keep a combo going here is much more strict, there's no indicator of how much time you have left to continue a combo, and you have a more limited moveset that makes it hard to vary up your tactics during a single fight. You only have 1.5 seconds to string attacks together to maintain a stylish rank, which is very tight considering Dante is more sluggish in this game, with lower run speed and longer recovery animations. These problems could have been alleviated by just making that window a little bit longer, even half a second would help. It defeats the sense of keeping a cool combo going as you fight, since it's so easy to lose it. It's still an idea that I really appreciate, one that just needed a bit of refinement. Obtaining S ranks can be incredibly strict on some missions, especially since a part of your ranking is the time it took to complete a level. This was a feature that I could never really get behind because it could encourage or dissuade you from playing a certain way. There's always a clock ticking in the back of your mind that tells you to complete levels as fast as you can, so instead of experimenting against different enemies, you'll routinely use methods that you're familiar with, or just burst them down as fast as you can, with little regard for style or variety. This is only true of the end mission style grades. The in-game style rankings for your combos serves its purpose fine, rewarding you for using different moves. Repeating the same attack has diminishing returns on your style, so even though Dante only has a few moves, there's still incentive to explore what's there and to see where each move is applicable. This mechanic is arguably the signature feature of the series' combat, and that's not just from a gameplay perspective. Something I always enjoyed about DMC, especially in the games after this one, is that it's not afraid to play up the motif of the slick, badass devil hunters with big swords and witty comebacks. All of that started here, and even though the story in this game is largely inconsequential, they still managed to create a cool protagonist that fills this role. DMC 1 Dante is quite different to the Dantes of DMC 3 through 5. He's more low-key with his flippant remarks and speaks with more confidence rather than snark. There's not a lot of dialogue between Dante and his demon adversaries because there doesn't need to be. This iteration of Dante is cool without having to try very hard. He stands in contrast to the dark atmosphere the rest of the game has. For the time, he was a very unique protagonist.
Block off, Featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way.
Aside from some parts of DMC 3, this is also the only game where we get a real glimpse of his vulnerable side. This is most obvious at the end when it's assumed that Trish has died. I don't really have any comments for the emotional weight of this scene because there isn't much. The same jokes about Dante's line here have been done again and again. I still wanted to bring it up though because it's a side of Dante that feels a little lost nowadays. He's more human here. It reminds me of some of the later parts of DMC 3 where his final encounter with Virgil is clearly more emotionally driven. I liked him in this game. He added a lot of charm, and strong characterization like that gives these games their personality. The same can be said about the game's setting and atmosphere. It's very easy to see DMC's roots as a Resident Evil game because of how dreary and eerie Malay Island's castle is. The ambient music that echoes throughout the hallways makes it a little creepy, combined with the washed-out look and grotesque creatures that still lurk there. The overall presentation of the game is strong, but I have a light criticism of the menus and cutscenes. This is version specific. The game is in widescreen in the HD version, but the menus aren't, so you get these black bars on either side and it doesn't look very clean. Some of the cutscenes are also pre-rendered from what looks like the PS2 version, which again isn't egregious, it's just odd. Another important part of this game's presentation that often gets overlooked in this regard is the camera. Before I tear this most obvious flaw apart, I will praise it for this. The atmosphere is in part due to the fixed camera angles. This camera style works well for horror games because it can be used to build tension. The player loses an element of control, and the game can position it in a way to hide certain dangers or frame the gameplay in a particular way. It lends to the creepiness. Devil May Cry is an action game, though, where full, fluid control of your character is important. The camera fails in this sense for a few reasons. First, Dante always moves relative to the camera angle, which means when there's an angle switch, you have to re-coordinate your analog stick to compensate. When you get an angle switch in the middle of a fight, your movement gets thrown off, which can interrupt your attacks or dodging, since you may jump in a different direction than you wanted. This is really cumbersome in the more confined areas where camera switches are more common. The game knows this because boss arenas and areas that have lots of enemies are typically open enough that the camera can pan around a little or just not switch angles very often to keep Dante and the enemy on screen. There are obviously exceptions to this, and it still isn't perfect. The camera has to keep Dante as the focus, so if the enemy moves off-screen, you may have to try deliberately triggering an angle switch, which is really awkward if you don't know the arena. This could be viewed as a way to diversify your skills, since fighting an off-screen enemy relies more on sound cues or quicker reaction times as opposed to reading telegraphs. This works for some enemies like the Death Scissors and Shadows, but it doesn't feel like all enemies were designed with that in mind. Some of them will still attack you from off-screen at a moment you're not expecting it, and you'll get hit for something that doesn't feel like your fault. The other quirk with this is with the moves that rely on directional inputs. These lock-on directional input moves still exist all the way up to DMC 5, and I've still seen people debate it. You can lock onto an enemy and then input an attack while moving the stick relative to where the character is facing, not where the camera is facing. This is less of a problem in the later games because you have some or full control of the camera, but here it's the same issue as with movement. Since the directional inputs for some attacks is always changing, you have to change your analog stick angles regularly, and there are points where the game just won't agree with the way you're doing it. You might try to stinger or high time and just get a regular attack instead, which requires you to pause for a second and collect your bearings. Rolling is the same way since it's a directional input to Dante's side. This is even more awkward because Dante's sides are narrower than his front and back. Jumping is a more reliable dodge anyway, but that just moves the problem. Now your jumps have to be planned around the camera the same way your movement does. The camera is very restrictive on your movement overall, and it's easily one of the hardest parts of the game to get used to. It's interesting to think about how this game would have been different if it had the same camera as DMC 3. In that game, the camera usually sits behind Dante and gives you control of it in open areas. It remains fixed in some places, but it pans around to follow you instead of switching angles constantly. 3 very easily has the superior camera, but 1's camera is a big part of its identity, and that would be lost if it had a more modern, traditional action game camera. Furthermore, since the enemies had to be designed around fixed angles, it's hard to say whether the game would strictly be better if the camera was the only thing that was changed. If fixed angles remained, but pans were used more often than instantaneous switches, this problem could have been partially alleviated without having to reconsider all of the enemy designs. Let's be more positive for a bit and talk about the level design. Later DMC games, particularly DMC 3, consist of a mix of open enemy rooms separated by basic puzzles or locked areas that require some item to serve as a key. You'll backtrack through the same areas multiple times to enter different rooms or find new items that weren't present before. DMC 1 follows a similar structure to this, but with far less puzzles and winding pathways. It uses a pretty basic get this item to open this area formula, something else that can be attributed to its Resident Evil roots. While there is still backtracking in some levels, much of that time is spent just moving Dante from one point to another with a few enemies sprinkled in. Among the series, Devil May Cry 1 maintains the best balance of puzzle rooms versus long hallways versus enemy areas. Some sections of 3 and 4 get in the way of the action by giving you a rudimentary puzzle between areas, while 5 is very linear with almost no puzzles and little interconnectedness between levels. Unfortunately, DMC 1 is the only game that I'd consider having quote-unquote gimmick levels that don't have a place in the game. The first one is less major, but still something I think it could have done without. The underwater sections are just unnecessary. Moving Dante around in this first-person, floaty environment where all you can do is shoot doesn't feel nearly as good as the 3D land environments where everything else feels much snappier. The second is one that I'll come back to, but I consider it equally unnecessary because it's a total departure from the other levels. If you've played the game, you probably know what I'm talking about. One more point I want to make about the levels is how the game provides incentive to go back through the castle and explore more thoroughly. There's the blue orb fragments, the same as heart pieces from Zelda. You find them throughout the map, and collecting 4 gives you a boost to your max life, and the secret missions. I have less to say about the blue orb fragments because I think they're fine. Sprinkling these collectibles throughout the map creates a minor sense of progression that builds to a larger benefit to your character. I have more of a problem with the secret missions. These are accessed by returning to previous rooms or areas that are unmarked. All they are is completing a task to collect a blue orb fragment as a reward. Some of them are fine, you just have to kill some enemies within a time limit or face a tougher group of enemies like the Triple Shadows. Most of them, though, are just boring and or frustrating. I'm not trying to be reductive, but I don't see how the game benefits from doing most of these secrets. Some of them require a degree of platforming. There's one where you bounce off the heads of Sin Scissors to reach a fragment, and another where you jump up a staircase of skulls. The jumping in this game was not designed for these platforming sections at all. You have minimal control of Dante while he's mid-jump, and he has a very short airtime. It was designed to be a dodging tool, not meant for precise platforming like these, which reduces these missions into doing some monotonous jumps until you get it, at which point you let out a sigh of relief and a thank God that's over. Others have you killing enemies in a particular way, landing a perfect headshot on a Sin Scissors, killing enemies in an underwater section, or for some reason, awkwardly luring some Cyclops into shooting or jumping on each other until they die. Most of these suffer from the same problem as the platforming sections, they're making you do something the game wasn't designed for. I'd prefer these secret missions if they were just made simpler. Killing the 3 shadows is fun, these missions would have been fine if they were just unique enemy layouts or more time-based challenges instead of what they are. They teeter on the edge of those gimmick levels for me. While the secret missions are very inconsistent in quality, I'm very pleased with the game's boss lineup, it's arguably the game's greatest strength. With a few glaring exceptions, every boss in this game is well thought out. DMC is one of the few games where I think repeated boss fights are done well. Aside from the final boss, you fight all of the bosses more than once, and as the fights progress, they gain new attacks and behave more aggressively. The important thing here is that all bosses serve a meaningful purpose, and they test you on each element of combat, which is how I think boss fights should be, a test of your abilities. Phantom is a tutorial fight to test your comfort with the controls. He requires some simple dodging and timing techniques, and you have to study him for a bit to understand how he works, but there's also some little tricks that can make the fight go a bit faster. He's only vulnerable on his mouth and his thorax back area. When he spits a fireball, you can reflect it back at him with proper timing, and if you can align a Helm Breaker properly, you can slam down on him to strike both of his hitboxes for essentially double the damage with one attack. Neither of these things are at all required to beat him, which makes sense. His telegraphs are slower since he's the first boss that teaches the importance of studying your enemies. There's just some extra goodies for you to discover once that's all done, and I really like that. Nello Angelo tests you on your melee combat, and I think his fights are the best for a few reasons. He provides many opportunities to be aggressive, and you're rewarded for it. You can clash attacks to interrupt his moves, and there's periods of downtime where he taunts you that allow you to sneak in some extra hits, or taunt back if you want to replenish some Devil Trigger. More interestingly, he fights like Dante, which makes sense given his identity as his twin brother. Almost all of his attacks are close range, and he can trap you in combos or follow up after you thought you dodged him adequately. Simply put, he's fair, and he keeps you on your toes the entire time. You have opportunities to combo him since he gets stunned, but you still can't get complacent until he's finally dead. Griffin is a boss that I'm conflicted with. He tests you on your ranged combat since guns are the most reliable way to damage him, and that's fine. In fact, the boss itself is almost as equally as good as Nello Angelo. Unfortunately, Griffin is brought down by some poor boss arenas in the second and third fights, the Ghost Ship and the Colosseum respectively. Griffin's Ghost Ship fight is the worst boss in the game. To be frank, it's amazing how a boss as problematic as this one is in the same game as Nello Angelo's final fight, which is nigh perfect in my opinion. The camera almost always sits far away from Dante and Griffin, which I assume is because it can't position itself around the numerous obstacles sprinkled throughout the ship. You can't see Griffin easily while he's in the air, and his red Phoenix minion will hog your auto-target, so it's tricky to shoot him off-screen. When Griffin lands, that's your opportunity to be aggressive, but it's made frustrating because of how difficult it is to reliably dodge when the camera and arena are constantly wrestling with you. You'll get stuck on things when you're trying to move around, and Griffin is so damn big compared to the ship that it's hard to even read his telegraphs. This fight should have been removed as far as I'm concerned. The first and third fights would have been good enough. The third fight in the Colosseum is better only because the one major obstacle breaks about a third into the battle. There's a large bridge atop the Colosseum which makes the camera behave weirdly, like it wants to keep the bridge out of frame even though Griffin is constantly in the air above it. Again, you can't see him half the time, so I question why such a thing was put there in the first place. Thankfully, Griffin will fall through the bridge and destroy it after you deal enough damage, at which point he remains largely grounded. Nightmare is more peculiar. It tests your micromanaging ability via the dials and cores. Nightmare is only vulnerable when one of the dials in the room is activated. It will expose one of 2 cores that will remain until the dial timer reaches 0, at which point it becomes invulnerable again. These cores will also change color if they take too many hits. If they turn green, Nightmare's attacks become more aggressive, and if they turn red after that, then they gain a massive defense boost. I like both of these traits. Nightmare is a slower and more methodical boss that requires more planning rather than thinking on the fly. It's a good change of pace, especially since you only encounter Nightmare later in the game, at which point you should be used to the traditional style of bosses. My only two complaints with Nightmare are simple ones. It should somehow be communicated better that the cores can actually change if you hit them too much. There's no way of knowing about this system until you've hit one of the cores enough, at which point you accidentally made the fight harder for yourself. It takes away from the methodical approach since you won't understand how the boss works the very first time and thus can't plan around it. The second problem is, again, more of an issue with the arena, this time in the third fight during the final phase. Having Nightmare shoot thin, bright white lasers while the core glows white, parts of the floor glow white, and the surrounding force field is a bright blue probably wasn't the best idea. It's difficult to see what actually hits you during this otherwise exciting section. This concept of a change of pace battle is done much better with Nightmare than it is with the final boss, and this is where we go back to the gimmick stages that I was talking about earlier. Mundus has two phases, the first of which is a basic rail shooter that I've tried really hard to convince myself into liking. In the end, I don't think it belongs in this game. It's a better fight than Ghost Ship Griffin, but it's bad for different reasons. Recall that up to this point, bosses have all tested you on different elements of combat, and for the most part they were all very well done. Through that lens, it's easy to see why they did something drastically different with Mundus. You proved yourself at every other boss, so we'll throw a curveball with a completely new style of gameplay. That doesn't make it automatically bad, so long as the new gameplay retains the uniqueness and depth of what's being abandoned. This is where the fight suffers. Even if the whole game were a rail shooter, I would still consider this phase of Mundus to be a bad fight because it's so boring. You make significantly less decisions during this section than the other bosses, because your combat choices have been stripped away, and Mundus's attacks are much simpler than other attacks in a 3D space. You don't switch between weapons, and you have an incredibly shallow move pool. You mash a face button to shoot, and you can use Vortex to smash through some of his attacks. Devil Trigger is no longer something you switch in and out of. Instead, Dante becomes a dragon and hits Mundus for a damage bomb. This is all incredibly bare bones on its own, but the other issue is that most of his attacks are easy to dodge. If he's shooting either of his needle attacks at you, move in a tight circle and you won't get hit. Rocks and lasers can be nullified completely by Vortex. He also has two lightning-based attacks, one that behaves similarly to Griffin's lightning pillars, and another that has you dodging rotating beams that fly towards you at random. Some are better than others, but all of these attacks stray far from the level of care that's demanded of you in other fights, and I consider Phase 1 Mundus to be one of the easiest bosses in the game because his patterns are so simple. The hardest part is having the stamina to mash your shooting button for 5 minutes straight. If you recall what I said at the beginning of the video, what makes the combat in this game interesting is the intricate enemy design and an emphasis on stylish combos. Neither of that is present during this Mundus fight, and I wish the whole thing could have just been the second phase. This part is much better. It's not perfect, but it's better. Phase 2 is a much slower paced fight, but it's suitable because attacking Mundus requires more commitment. You need time to charge up round trips and meteors, or you need to get close to him for melee strikes, or you need to ignore Mundus and deal with the orbs that he sends out. All of these decisions take more time to execute than the standard melee attacking you've been using up to this point, so Mundus needs to have slower telegraphs to compensate. It's a change from what you're used to, but it still requires some thinking and proper responses. What I dislike about this fight is the incentive to use platforming and the element of luck that isn't present in other fights. One of the most effective ways to damage Mundus is to jump close to him on the floating platforms so your melee attacks can reach. The camera is usually positioned behind Dante and facing the platforms though, so it's difficult to line your jumps up properly because you can't see how big the gaps are. Mundus can also summon a dragon that drops a healing orb when you kill it, but the attacks that bosses use in this game are mostly random, so there's no guarantee that he'll spawn the dragon to give you a heal during this fight. Randomness affects Mundus more than others because as far as I know, this is the only attack in the game that gives you a consistent health reward for handling it properly. When you know what you're doing, this isn't as impactful, but it can still make or break some nail-biter fights against him. I have had close fights with Mundus where he and I are close to death, but then he decides to spawn a dragon, and there's this release in tension because I know I've won before the fight is over, especially since the dragon is easy to kill. That said, finally killing Mundus is still a satisfying conclusion to the challenges you've surmounted up to this point, especially on DMD where all the bosses can be brutal. It's more for self-satisfactory reasons rather than story reasons though. I don't consider the story or its conclusion a significant part of Devil May Cry. The story is more there to supplement Dante's character, and that's okay, because Dante is a strong part of the game's presentation. There are a lot of instances of tell, don't show, given that the backstory of Dante, Virgil, Trish, and Mundus are all just explained or alluded to rather than shown. DMC didn't need a story to be good. If it was the exact same game minus all the cutscenes, it would probably still be viewed similarly to how it is now, and I would enjoy it just as much. The game has enough personality through the visual design, but none of that comes close to the level of replay value that the game has and how much fun it is to play. I realize a lot of the criticism in this video sounded largely negative, but that's because there's fewer negatives than positives. I could sing praises to everything that works in this game for hours because there's a lot of it, but in an effort to keep things more focused, I haven't done that. Devil May Cry is not one of the hardest games out there, not even close, but the level of challenge balanced by the freedom and satisfaction it gives you has made it a memorable experience, and even with all the problems it has, I still think a lot of people today would enjoy it. The amount of detail included in the combat difficulty and bosses for a game of this era is incredible. It has some shining examples of what I look for in a good game nowadays. Whether it's the best DMC game is up for debate, but I think it's inarguable that it's the most unique of the bunch. Exceeding the first Devil May Cry game should not be difficult. There are a lot of things that could be improved, but it's still been a joy to analyze one of the big influencers in 3D action games. If I do something similar like this with its sequels, I hope you'll come back to join me in the discussion. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video.
5 minutes.
More than enough.
So while I let the credits roll, I just want to reel off a few things about me and what the deal with this video was, I guess. This was just a personal project that I really wanted to take on after I beat Devil May Cry because I thought it was a really interesting game. I wanted to talk about it. I've never made something like this before. This is my first time, so I'm well aware that a lot of things could be improved, particularly the audio. I'm not super happy with it, but it's the best I got. And there are, some other games that I would like to talk about, which maybe I'll do. I guess it depends on the reception to this video. But yeah, if you did watch the whole thing, I would love to hear what you thought. If you have a comment or message me on Twitter or something. If you have either thoughts on the game or thoughts on the video, whatever, that'd be really cool. So yeah, that does it for me. Thank you again for watching, and hope you have a good day. Bye.